and so it's nice to be here. Okay. The what the University of California does here in Sacramento, in my opinion, is pretty important, and it's a reflection on the University of California overall. So as you know, there aren't too many public universities of the stature of the University of California left in our world. In fact, there aren't any. And oftentimes, what makes the University of California remarkable is that despite the fact that we're a public university, we compete with and are ranked with the very best private universities in the world. And that's a remarkable feature, and it's a feature that I believe California has benefited from greatly. So that the University of California has benefited from the largesse of the state budget. The flip side of that is that if you were to try to compute the increment to state economic growth over all the decades based on training done in the University of California, be it law or medicine or business or any field, there's just an incredible contribution, and I'm gonna try to contribute a little bit today as well. Now, the idea with policy is that we like to understand policy impacts, and we like to understand whether policy works or not. And it's unfortunate because a lot of times the legislature will write a law, but they won't write in evaluation of that law. And then the legislators themselves are term limited out, or they move on like Kamala Harris did, or they just retire, whatever. And so here we are today, we're going to talk about the financial crisis and some laws passed here in the state of California. And the absurd thing about it is that until we decided to study this law, nobody, and I mean nobody, in the state of California had looked at it. Nobody here in Sacramento has any idea whether the foreclosure prevention laws passed by the state legislature during the crisis period worked or didn't. Not the foggiest idea. There's been no evaluation. And so one of the things that the University of California can contribute, and what we would recommend, is something that I'm sure you all feel strongly about. It's called evidence-based public policy. In other words, figure out what the impacts of the policy are and do stuff that works. And the metaphor, the analogy that I like to use is medicine. I mean, some of you in this room are taking a medication of some sort. And you probably know that medication goes through the FDA. And at the FDA, there are things called double-blind studies. And there are treatment groups, and there are control groups. And they try to get the control group as close as possible to the treatment group so that they can infer if the treatment group gets better, it's because of the medication and not because of random effects. And then they can tell you, well, this medication will help your blood pressure or your cholesterol or your whatever the issue is. And we should be doing the same thing with respect to any other piece of policy. And I'm going to show you some treatment and control, the way that we did this here, and some bottom lines. Oh, good afternoon. And so just to get to the punchline before I begin, turns out that the California foreclosure prevention laws worked pretty well. And I'm not sure if anyone writing the laws had that expectation or whatever, but anyway, we're gonna get into that. So okay, so for some of you who are older in the room, and we have two sides of the room, you have undergraduates at the University of California campuses on that side, and a more mature audience on this side. And not to say they aren't mature, they're very, very mature. I just met with them. They're wonderfully mature. Anyway, for those of you who have been around for a while, you know that the 2000s were not a happy period, or at least the latter half of the 2000s here in the state of California. The tremendous boom-bust cycle in housing and failed mortgages here in the state of California that had really nasty effects on our state economy, reverberated from California around the United States and became a global financial crisis to the point where we're talking about Great Recession, where Great Recession was maybe that far from Great Depression. And there were days when we didn't know whether we were headed for a second Great Depression, global. So on average, California house prices fell by about a third. It's a lot. 800,000 California homeowners went into foreclosure. That's a lot. And there were concerns about this Great Depression. So policymakers, both in Washington, D.C. and here in California, came upon this idea that we've got to figure out a way to mitigate this default and foreclosure crisis. Because with the default and foreclosure crisis, we were seeing concentrations of foreclosure. We were seeing neighborhoods that were imploding. We were seeing a social fabric that was imploding. We were seeing house prices that were plummeting down, et cetera. And the idea was, can we modify mortgages? In other words, can we renegotiate the terms of those mortgages to allow homeowners to stay in their homes, hopefully to engage in upkeep of those homes, to mitigate against these neighborhoods where there was an absolute spiral down with respect to foreclosure, and to help to push the housing market, the mortgage market, local economies, the state economy, and all the rest in the right direction. So the U.S. government enacted a program called HAMP, then another program after that called HARP. And these things were in existence until maybe even a year ago. HAMP stands for Home Affordable Modification Program. The federal government sought to incent mortgage modifications. That was really complicated because a lot of these modifications were in mortgage-backed securities, and so a lot of the mortgages were in securitized form. It was not easy to get at them to get to modification. But anyway, the U.S. government program did not succeed. We've had a fair amount of evaluation of the U.S. government program. It reached only about a third of its targeted audience. And one reason for that was that the modification that the U.S. government engaged in was entirely piecemeal. It was mortgage by mortgage. That meant that you needed a lender, contact a borrower for there to be negotiation. There was financial incentive for that negotiation, for a modification to be concocted, and then to go forward from there. It was very cumbersome. It was very difficult. Lenders didn't have infrastructure to reach borrowers one at a time. So you have this mountain of default and foreclosure, and we're picking off individual mortgages to try to remediate the crisis. That was hard to do. But California took its own course, and two laws were passed. I'm going to tell you about those two laws in a minute. And those laws, collectively, we call the California Foreclosure Prevention Laws. And California was salient in its own right. We're big. And it all started here. And just like when we do smog control or emissions control or whatever we do in California, we often set the stage for the nation as a whole. So California passed its own laws. In fact, Kamala Harris, our state senator right now, was pretty involved. And here, in a metaphor to the world of medication, the treatment effects were different. Because instead of treating one mortgage holder at a time, we treated lenders. And we said, you, lender X, will not be allowed to engage in foreclosure activity whatsoever regarding any of the loans that you own, unless you do X, Y, and Z. So it didn't matter if there was a negotiation between the lender and the borrower. We're just treating lenders. We're imposing foreclosure moratoria on broad segments of the population. As I said earlier, little attention, no evaluation to whether any of this worked or not. In other words, here we have two competing policies. We have the federal policy, we have the California policy. It might be nice after something as egregiously disruptive as the financial crisis to know which one worked or didn't work or why. Maybe we could employ that information in the future. So we're doing some of that. So we're studying the effects of the California foreclosure prevention laws on mortgage modification, foreclosure mitigation, and stabilization of the California housing market. Okay, I'm going to come to this side now, and then I'll go back after a while. But anyway, that's all I can do, right? So a little bit of language, a little bit of background. I'll try to go through this quickly, and it's hard to make some of this stuff entertaining, but I'll try. And then I'll go to show you some results. There are two types of states in the world when it comes to foreclosure law. They're called judicial foreclosure states and non-judicial foreclosure states. That means exactly as it sounds. In the judicial foreclosure states, notably including Florida, foreclosures have to go through the courts. That's the judiciary. It's a cumbersome process. It takes a long time, and it means that foreclosures move very slowly. California is a non-judicial foreclosure state. That meant, leading up to the crisis, foreclosure is really easy. I'm a lender. You're a borrower. You're not performing. That means you're not paying your mortgage. According to their contract, I have the legal right to take the collateral if you're not paying your loan. You're not paying your debt. All I have to do to take that collateral to foreclose on the home is to put a letter in the mail to you. I don't have to pick up the phone. Just put a letter in the mail to you. It's called a notice of default. Wait 90 days, and then put another letter in the mail to you called notice of sale, at which point I show up, I put your couch on the curb, I sell your home at auction, or I take it back into my portfolio as a lender. That's all that's required. So the first of the California foreclosure prevention laws, Senate Bill 1137, July 2008. What did it do? It basically threw a wrench into this whole process. It tried to slow down this process, and it tried to get lenders to talk to borrowers about such a thing as foreclosure alternatives. Turns out that borrowers, as we learned during the crisis, and the Federal Reserve did a lot of work on this, borrowers, almost to the borrower, didn't understand the mortgage contracts they were signing. And borrowers, almost to the borrower, don't have the sophisticated financial literacy required to understand an option arm, or understand a negatively amortizing option arm, or all the other products that were being sold in that day. So borrowers didn't even know that they had alternatives to foreclosure. So required the lender to contact the homeowner to talk about alternatives to foreclosure, gave the borrower 14 days to think about that, come back to ask questions. It required the lender to wait an additional 30 days post-contact to issue the notice of default. The legislature here in Sacramento was knowledgeable of the fact that many of these foreclosure clusters turned into deserts where there was non-maintenance and downward spiral in neighborhood and all the rest. So they required the new legal owner of the foreclosed property to maintain it or pay fines of $1,000 a day. This piece of legislation was implemented immediately, unlike the federal law, and applicable to all owner-occupied homes originated during the boom period. It didn't matter if you had a prime, subprime, whatever, another distinguishing characteristic. So the benefits here, real quickly: immediate implementation. Borrowers are treated. In other words, they get remediation even if they have no contact with the lender, because the lender is treated, not the borrower. The lender is treated by the state law. Modification is encouraged. The rate at which homes enter into foreclosure is slowed, and the fines on lack of maintenance mean that we have neighborhoods that are better maintained. What are the risks? That this may be a Band-Aid that only, kind of puts what I call a temporal Band-Aid on the wound, and 3 months later, all the foreclosures come to bear. So we simply push foreclosures into the future. Or lenders could say the following. They could say, look, the state of California has legally interfered with my property rights. In other words, I, as a lender, have the right to foreclose if the borrower doesn't perform. The state's now telling me I don't have that right. So there could be retribution by lenders. They could say, hey, why do I lend in California? Or if I do lend in California, I'm going to lend at a higher mortgage interest rate, or I'm going to reject more people in the lending environment because you've just taken away my basic right to foreclose, or you've delayed it, or made it more expensive. So we have to evaluate whether there are adverse side effects. That's the first piece of legislation. Okay, now, right side. The second one is called the CFPA, the California Foreclosure Prevention Act. This had a lot of teeth. In this particular act, the state said, I'm going to impose a 90-day moratorium on foreclosure. That is a full blanket moratorium on foreclosure on any lender that fails to enact and make broadly available a modification program for basically all borrowers. So basically, you have the first 90-day period. Now you have a second 90-day period. So now we're talking 6 months of delay in foreclosure activity imposed by the state on any lender that did not become active with respect to modification. Of course, lenders could be exempted if they enacted such a modification program. There were borrower eligibility requirements and acceptable modification requirements. That's some of the detail. I can come back to that. I have the feeling my time's going to go fast. I usually lecture for 3 hours at a shot, because I teach MBAs, and that's what we do. So you put in the nickel, and I go for 3 hours. So I don't want to do that to you. You're just on your lunch break. So if you want detail, there's also a whole paper on this, by the way, if you want to read it all. So our questions are straight up kind of social science, evidence-based policy, etc. Did these laws, now I'm going to use a word. The word is cause. And causality is a big deal in statistics. As I and the students were talking about earlier, causality is different than correlations. It could be during the period of these laws, foreclosures went down or house prices went up. They'd be correlated temporally. Does that necessarily then imply that the laws were responsible for the upward movement in house prices or the downward movement in foreclosure? The answer is no. So we have to, as scientists, we have to establish causation. And that's often very difficult to do. But I'm talking about causation here. I'm not talking about correlation. So did these laws, can we show an effect on modifications? Did they increase modifications? Did they reduce defaults? Did they reduce foreclosures? If they reduced defaults and foreclosures, did they bolster house prices? House prices were spiraling down. Did they spiral down less as a consequence of these laws? Now we know from consumer theory that when you buy a car or some big consumer durable, you buy it out of your savings account as well as out of your current income. When you use your savings, it's called the propensity to consume out of wealth. So now, when we're mitigating the decline in house prices, you have more housing, you have more home equity, you have more housing-related wealth. And did you use that wealth to buy consumer durables? That could be a broader effect of the laws. So we test that. Did these laws prolong the crisis and simply delay foreclosures to a later date? So a little bit of politics here. At the national level, we have two people very prominent in very prominent places. First is Larry Summers, professor of economics at Harvard, head of the National Economic Council in the first Obama White House. Second is Tim Geithner. You remember that name. He was Secretary of Treasury under Obama during the crisis period. They both said foreclosure moratoria don't work. Don't even think about them. And here's the rationale. And I've come up with this metaphor in the last day or two. You may or may not like it. We're going to put a Band-Aid on a big wound. Geithner and Summers' hypothesis, similar to many in the economics profession, is that you rip off that Band-Aid after 3 months and the wound continues to gush, continues to bleed, it continues to be a problem. And that would be a simple delay. Whereas the alternative hypothesis is somehow you put the Band-Aid on the wound, and somehow in the 3-month period, the wound heals. So that when you pull it off, you've seen some effect. But Geithner and Summers were very negative about these programs. Really didn't want anything to do with them. Okay, what do we know outside of our research? As I said, we know almost nothing. And if there's someone here from state government that wants to refute this assertion, I'd be more than pleased to hear from you. But here's what we know. And what we know is in the dimension of, at best, correlation, having nothing to do with causality. So here we know 3 or 4 factoids. That's been the entirety of discussion of these laws. Point number 1, there were a lot of modifications relative to foreclosures in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. That's nice, a lot of modifications. It sounds like there is an algorithm for modification, and it sounds like modifications may be playing a role. We don't know. That's just a fact. There's no analysis. Number 2, the vast majority of the modifications were not undertaken via the federal program. So maybe there's some room for the state program. That's yet another fact that seems to point in the direction of some efficacy of the program. Number 3, a large number of mortgages here in the state of California fell outside of the boundaries of modification programs. In other words, were subject to the moratoria. Okay? Now, and there was some limitation and take-up of the state program and whatever. Here's our suspicion, by the way. Our suspicion is that lenders in the state of California, instead of strenuously objecting to this taking of their legal rights to foreclose, you would think that lenders would be in line to throw rotten fruit at the state capitol and do things a lot worse than that because you're taking away their right to foreclose. We think it was exactly the opposite. The lenders quietly were in concurrence with this. This was a timeout. Imagine you're Wells Fargo Bank and you're lending in Riverside County. Every home in the block is in foreclosure. And imagine that you own a lot of those loans. Well, firstly, there's a danger that your write-offs are so large you're going to be put out of business. And that's exactly what happened to many lenders in the state, including some very prominent lenders. So timeout and recognizing these losses could be a good thing. Secondarily, there could be individuals in these neighborhoods who are paying their mortgages and doing just fine. But the drop in property value associated with the foreclosure crisis was infecting all of their homes as well. So the fact that if you have this timeout, 6 months, we saw very little in our analysis that suggested that lenders were unhappy. So what do? We do a bunch of statistical work. I'm not going to tell you about the details. It's all in the paper. You can read all about it and have a really good night's sleep tonight. But yes, ma'am. Well, I'll show you. I'm going to come to all of that detail momentarily. Can you wait like 1 minute? I'm going to give you all the details. So I'm going to show you the outcome terms. But basically, well, you'll see momentarily. But we find a salutary, a positive, sizable decrease in foreclosure activity in the state, 16%. Reduction in foreclosure, 380,000 California homeowners saved from losing their homes. We see an increase in the mortgage modification rate, 29% in relative terms. We see that California house prices were bolstered by about 6%. That added about $300 billion to housing wealth in the state of California. We'll show you the differential effects across different counties in the state. We see that wealth translated into generalized positive economic effects in terms of spending on durable goods. We don't see any effect of the laws on lingering delinquencies, a prolongation of the crisis, or a delay of foreclosures to a later date. And we don't see any adverse effects of the law with respect to the flow of capital for mortgage finance in the state. So we see that actually, maybe inadvertently, not sure that policymakers really even asked these questions, but inadvertently, this program was actually a smashing success. And it's, wow. Okay, so the California foreclosure prevention laws were substantially more effective than their federal counterpart in stabilizing housing markets and mitigating foreclosures. And contrary to concerns regarding the fact that you put the Band-Aid on, you rip it off, and the wound continues to bleed, we showed that, in fact, you took the Band-Aid off, the wound did not continue to bleed, that there was actually positive beneficial effects that were long-lived. And I'm going to show you a demonstration of all of that. Now, this is ugly, but this is what I do for business, for a living, rather. I work on data. And now to answer some questions about where the data comes from and what we're looking at here. There is no analysis in these slides. None. This is just a jumping off point. What are we doing here? We're plotting for the pre-crisis boom period, for the period where we're treating the patient, administering the drug. That's the period in which the California foreclosure laws were in effect. And for the period after they're in effect, we're plotting movement in a bunch of outcome terms for California relative to other sand states. Now, I have to define a little bit. First of all, so we're plotting California versus Arizona, Florida, and Nevada. During the period of the crisis, we had this thing called sand states. They're all states that have sand. Some have beach sand, some have interior sand. We have both in California. I think we're the only state that has both kinds of sand. Now, on a more serious note, these states are our simple control group here. And again, I'm not going to say anything causal because there's no analysis. I'm just creating sort of a straw person here. So these are all states with, during the crisis, oversupply of housing. These are all states with a lot of subprime lending. These are all states that look a lot like California in terms of the dynamics of housing markets. So they're the control group. California is the treatment. And I want to see what's happening to, foreclosure starts, prime and subprime. So I think the foreclosure data, by the way, excuse me, what's your name? Eileen, I believe comes from the Mortgage Bankers Association. The Zillow term comes from Zillow. The Mortgage Default Risk Index is our own. We developed that. FIFA housing returns, this is Federal Housing Finance Agency, and we also have Zillow data on returns for different tiers of the market. So anyway, we're plotting. Now, red line is when SB 1137 goes into effect. The purple line is the sunset of policy. So anything between these two lines, the green line is California Foreclosure Prevention Act. Anything between these lines is treatment. Anything to the right is post-treatment. Anything to the left is pre-treatment. You notice three things real quickly. First of all, California and the other sand states all look the same pre-treatment, pre-crisis. So it looks like the other sand states are an okay counterfactual for California. They're all moving together. Fact number two, post-crisis, immediately post-crisis, foreclosures drop in California relative to the other sand states, according to a variety of different measures. Mortgage risk drops and house price returns increase. And we see as well post-crisis that the results are kind of long-lived. I'm going to come back to that. So again, this is no analysis, but it's a sneak preview. It's a hint that maybe there's something there because we see, wow, among prime loans, among subprime loans, look at the black line relative to the green lines. It drops, and it drops by a fair amount. So that's our first hint that things are going okay. So now we do another analysis where we compare. These are our outcome terms. Foreclosure starts, prime and subprime foreclosures, Zillow foreclosures, mortgage default, and these house price terms. Now we're going to compare in column 5, we're going to quantify the effects. California versus the average of the other 3 sand states. And we see that foreclosure starts are down 8% in California during the treatment period. Prime and subprime, similarly. Mortgage default risk is down 36%. House price growth is up anywhere from 13 to 17%, 17% for the Zillow bottom tier. So this is a quantification of that effect. And we can do this analysis at the zip code level and at the county level as well. When we do it at the zip code and the county level, we have more data, we have more observations, we can run regressions, we can control for other factors. our results are significant, and they show during the treatment period, Zillow All Homes house price growth was up 8.5% in California. Zip codes relative to zip codes in the other states, similarly at the county level. Now I'm gonna play a little statistical game that you may or may not like. That is borrowed from some other applications, and it's called synthetic control. The best case scenario would be if I had a counterfactual for California during the crisis period that we all agreed was a really good counterfactual and was not treated. What do I mean by a counterfactual? I mean a control group where I can legitimately claim that this control group so matches California that if we know the path of this control group and we know the path of California, California gets the treatment. California gets the medication. The medication are the laws that are passed. The control group doesn't get the medication. We can ascribe the difference in outcomes between the treatment and the control group to the medication being the California foreclosure prevention laws. So if you do, again, what I do for a living, you read academic literature and you know of advances and blah, 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 blah. That's the story of my life. And sounds fascinating, right? And there's a statistical methodology called synthetic control. And what that means is rather than just call 3 states the control group, which is sort of, like pick any 3 states and call them the control group, I'm going to use a statistical algorithm to take untreated geographic units. Now, at the state level, there are 49 states that weren't treated by the California foreclosure prevention laws. At the zip code level, there are zip codes in the 49 states, and at the county level, there are counties in those 49 states. I can use all that data to sort of linearly combine and weight that data to create what I call a synthetic California. And I can call that synthetic California the control. And I look at the path of the outcome terms in the synthetic version of California, the untreated California, relative to the treated California. So again, a whole bunch of lines on the page, and if you go to my website at UCLA, you can download this whole thing, and then again, you'll sleep really well. But okay, so now we have pre-treatment, we have post-treatment, and between the red and the purple line, we have treatment. That's when the drug's administered straight into the vein. The blue lines in each case are the synthetic control. They're the counterfactual. They're the what if California had been left alone without these foreclosure prevention laws. The black line is actual California, where actual California is treated. Actual California gets the drugs. The distance between the 2 lines, the vertical distance, added up across the entirety of the treatment period from early 2008 to about 2011, is the magnitude of the treatment effect. So here, again, and how do we know we have a good synthetic control? Well, we don't. That's hard, but we think we do. Why do we think we do? Because our statistical algorithm takes from the untreated sample and weights the untreated sample in such a way that it minimizes the distance between the synthetic control and the actual California pre-treatment. So if you see that the black line, the blue line are on top of each other, it means that we've matched the 2 really, really, really well, which in turn gives us confidence to suggest that we've nailed California during the entirety of the treatment period. So that means the blue is the counterfactual, the black is the actual. So what do we see in the blue versus the black? Well, just what I've said. Really striking reductions in foreclosure activity across all the different foreclosure measures relative to what actually occurred in California. Really striking reduction in mortgage risk and upward movement in house prices. So now we can put this in tabular terms, and these are all the outcome terms: foreclosures, mortgage risk, house prices. Here's California. Here's the value of the synthetic control, and here's the difference between the 2, showing big differences, statistically significant. So foreclosure starts, which is essentially a notice of default. California, percent of all loans, about 16%. If California hadn't been treated, that number would have been 25%. So the difference between 25 and 16 is a 9% reduction relative to the control group in foreclosure starts as a consequence of the administration of the drug, as a consequence of treatment, and so on and so forth. So here in terms of house price growth, 19% higher house prices in California as a consequence of the treatment. I'm using the words as a consequence. That means causality. I am talking causality. These methodologies allow me to talk causality. How am I doing on time? Where am I? Almost done? A lot of people are sleeping already. Okay, so here we color code and look at the effects by geography. The biggest drop in foreclosure was in LA County, and other large drops in foreclosure in Inland Empire, San Bernardino, and in Central Valley, which we also knew was ground zero. Kern County, Tulare County, et cetera, as well as the Southern California coast. Because the biggest drops in foreclosure were in these areas, the largest increase in house prices was also in those areas. Those findings you see in these other charts as well. Here we show, I'm just about to wrap up, don't get too nervous. We show that the results were long-lived. Here's California loan delinquencies and California foreclosure inventory, pre, during, and post-treatment. The blue line is the synthetic control. What if there was no treatment? And to the right of the pink is after treatment. So remember, Summers and Gaitner said that once you pull off the Band-Aid, the wound's still bleeding. So what was the point? And these results show that you pull off the Band-Aid, and not only is the wound not bleeding, but the results are very long-lived because the course of California delinquencies and the course of California foreclosures is well below what it would have been had there been no treatment, all the way into 2014. So it shows some efficacy. So I'm done. We basically show that the California foreclosure prevention laws actually were incredibly successful, and I mean causally successful. We don't necessarily, I don't want to provide any editorials about, who came up with this idea and why. We'll just say that the results were actually inadvertently, maybe unexpectedly, very successful, highly successful relative to the federal program, successful on all these dimensions of house prices, foreclosures, modifications, default, durable goods spending, and all the rest. Had these laws been applied elsewhere, they would have also had a substantial effect. And so we have now, again, I'll conclude where I started. We have policy evaluation, and we have evidence of what works and what doesn't work. And this evidence, by the way, comes from the University of California. And if ever you're in a conversation with someone who says, why do we subsidize the University of California? One way of responding, by the way, the subsidy is really low these days. I think something like 18% of the UCLA budget comes from the state. So you call us a public university, but we're 82% non-public. But anyway, we do get money from the state, and we do give back to the state. We give back to the state in the research we do and in the students we train. Yes, ma'am. It's a great question. I'm not sure, but what these programs tried to do is it tried to help the lender to figure out, well, you can foreclose and it's going to cost you X to foreclose, or you can modify and it's going to cost you Y to modify. Turns out that Y in many cases may be less than X. But that didn't really compute prior to these programs. Right. I honestly don't know. We have a whole set of other problems today which would require that I take the rest of your afternoon. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, but so hemp was ubiquitous across the U.S. We didn't see anything in those states that was salient enough to rise to this occasion. Okay, that's an informative comment, and I'm going to take that back and think about that with my co-authors. However, my response in terms of the validity of our study is that take that away. All of the synthetic control is not a story about Nevada. And in fact, we tested what we call the robustness of the synthetic control to whether we used judicial foreclosure states or non-judicial foreclosure states or this, that, and the other, and always we came to the same result. So we think that our results are, this is a statistical word, it's called robust, which means we think they hold up across these different methodologies. But I will look into that. If you want to send me something on that, I'd be appreciative, or a citation or whatever. Yes, sir. So we're, obviously I don't know, but I think that there are a number of factors that contribute. One is the fact that we're in the midst of a crisis. And really, there's nothing on the shelf. We say, oh, in crisis like this, do X or do Y. So we're kind of inventing it as we go along. The standard economic thinking, which is what Summers and Gaitner embodied, is simply that foreclosure moratoria don't work. Why would they work? We're just, again, there's an economic incentive here for the lender to foreclose. You're just going to put this off by 3 months, and it's all going to be there when you take off the Band-Aid. What they didn't account for were other discoveries in the economics literature during this period. One discovery was that judicial foreclosure states, Florida, et cetera, did better during the crisis than non-judicial foreclosure states. So while everybody was thinking that Florida's a super inefficient place where it takes 2 years to foreclose on a home because it's got to go through the courts and blah, blah, blah. Turns out that was exactly the right policy, was to slow everything down. So they kind of succeeded despite themselves or despite any understanding of what they were doing. And what we learned through that literature, et cetera, is that if you can put this Band-Aid on, you're going to interrupt the fire sales, which were prevalent at the time. You're going to slow the flow of homes into the fire sales. You're going to make sure the homes are maintained. And you're going to somehow, maybe even mitigate some of the losses to the lenders, which could help with financial capital continuing to flow. There are a whole set of kind of unexpected nuances that I don't think people in Washington really appreciated at the time. Yes, ma'am. No. Um, no, it's because, well, first of all, this paper hasn't been published yet. We're going to try to publish that. But these are issues that some of you in state government, or even just people that study politics and policy probably confront on a daily basis. Like I was interviewed yesterday about this paper, and the woman interviewing me asked me, well, if we learn lessons that are going to help us next time around, and my answer was no. And I didn't say that because I was trying to be cute or anything else. I said that because the players are basically gone. There's very little learning in the system. The problems will be a little different. And I'm not sure if there's anything we're going to carry forward from this that will be sort of fundamental learning the next time around. Hopefully I'm wrong. Well, there's been a lot of evaluation in the scientific economics community of HAMP and now this program and many other things. What I was sort of talking about earlier was the fact that, and I'm getting this sneaking suspicion that maybe some of you in the room actually work across the street or somewhere around here. And there's this question of why it is that we don't build more robust evaluation into the legislation that we pass, if it is this type of interventionist legislation, so that we would be required to go back and there'd be a bit of funding available or some such thing to get a team of people together to undertake this evaluation. That would speak well about us rather than just this idea we're going to throw a bunch of darts at the wall or throw some mud at the wall, maybe some of it will stick, the rest of it will kind of slide down to the floor and whatever. Yeah, we're not going to be around to be responsible for the failures anyway, because by that time we'll be in the state, it will be in the U.S. Senate, or we'll be retired, or we'll be somewhere else. Yes. Oh, that I'm not positive. I don't know if there's been a good evaluation of HARP. There's been very significant evaluation of HAMP. And as I say, HAMP was directed at non-conforming mortgages. HARP was directed at conforming mortgages. Non-conforming, by the way, is all the non-prime, the subprime. Conforming means that the loans can be purchased by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So, yeah, I mean, there were just a whole bunch of idiosyncratic infrastructure issues and design issues that right. But at the end of the day, you could describe modification as a version of refinance. I mean, they were both taking mortgages that were non-performing and trying to get those mortgages to perform. Okay, but okay, that's I didn't study either of those programs. Yes. Okay, so what we call the diff and diff results, we, as I mentioned, we look at, well, we looked at sand states and then, right. And then we didn't look at Washington in particular, but because of the concerns that have been raised in the room about whether, always in a diff and diff, there's a subjective choice of the control group on the part of researcher, and we're very aware of that. That's why we went to the synthetic control. And as I mentioned, in the context of synthetic control, we do that both for judicial foreclosure states and for non-judicial foreclosure states and for the mix of the two, and we get very comparable results. I mean, have I drawn the lines for California versus Washington? No, I haven't. in right, right, yes. I think there was one more question over here. Yes, sir. Not from our paper. I just meant, will we as a society retain a memory